Hello everybody and welcome back. Before I get this video started, I just want to thank everybody for liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. It helps a ton and I really appreciate it. And to my new patrons, John, Deb, and Ron. Your support allows me to keep doing what I'm doing and covering these dams and doing updates on them. And the letters from Ted and Mick. If you want to send me anything, I will pop my P.O. box up on the screen right now. I'm now standing in front of Edenville Dam. You can see it just over my shoulder behind me. And up here is the lake bed. See, things are starting to look pretty green now, but there were some fire service stations that were actually advising people to not burn out here on the lake bed. With everything being so dry, it wouldn't take much to spark this up and have a big fire burn all the way through here. Some people would say maybe that would eliminate some of those cottonwoods though and actually be helpful. And then down here, this is the downstream area. So the falls are just in that area there. That will be a lot easier to see from the drone. Coming up this week, I do want to make an announcement that I will be doing mini live streams. We're coming up on kind of the time that the Sanford Dam failed, as well as the Edenville Dam embankment here. So there are a lot of events happening down there in Sanford, and I will be, like I said, live streaming a lot of those to my Facebook page. So if you want to check that out, make sure you follow the link in the description down below to my Facebook page and make sure you follow me there. At the end of this video, I'm going to be posting the engineering diagrams and details for both the Tobacco River Dam and the Edenville Dam right here. I'll either go over it myself or I'll use the webinar from the Four Lakes Task Force and the engineer portion of that to kind of describe what's going on there. And also, I said it earlier in the video, but just downstream here is where the second Edenville live camera is going to be, and that is going to go live this weekend as well. So make sure you head on over there and check out the perspective that we're going to get looking at the backside of this dam. The steam shovel was actually right over here in this area. You can't even tell it was there anymore with how things have all grown up, but I actually did talk to Michael this weekend, and he's going to start working on that dredge again. He did find a boiler for it and got a few other pieces to start the rebuild process, so that video will be coming very soon as well, probably after the Sanford anniversary of when the dams failed. So make sure you look out for that video as well. All right, let's head on over now, throw the drone up in the air, and see what we can see from that perspective. The drone is flying towards the west right now. We have Edenville Dam right here in the center of the screen, a little bit of rapids flowing through here towards the south. Where this water is flowing through is right where the Edenville embankment failed, and also where they're planning on putting the emergency auxiliary spillway, that labyrinth spillway that we'll hear about later in the video from the engineers from the Four Lakes Task Force. I'm now pivoting around the front of the Edenville Dam. We are facing towards the south. A lot of the erosion is happening on each side of these retaining walls. On that seawall over there on the left-hand side of the dam, looks like it's falling in the water a little bit more. Without the pressure from the sand and water on the front of it holding it up, it just keeps sinking a little bit further. Now kind of going to fly over towards the old rapid area. You can actually pick up two mallard ducks sitting down here on the bottom of the screen, a drake and a hen mallard. They are probably nesting right now and should be having babies very soon. Those should be hatching. But right here in the center of the screen used to be the old rapid area, as I just got done saying. With the water no longer coming over from the Tobacco River underneath that M30 Causeway Bridge, these have dried up quite a bit. There's a little bit of erosion happening here, cutting into that clay. Clay is our bedrock here in Michigan, so all of this has eroded all the way down to our current bedrock, and you can really see it in this area here. Kind of looks almost like the moon with all these craters and the little bit of water trailing through the center of it. Way off in the distance there in the middle of the screen is the M30 Causeway Bridge. They are currently paving that with asphalt. I'm over by the Verizon Tower right now, and right above me here is actually where the osprey are nesting. Turn the camera around. It's kind of hard to see from the GoPro, but they're way up there at the very top of the tower, and I'm actually following this story on my other YouTube channel. We're going to follow them while they nest, while they rebuild this nest since this was taken down earlier this winter. And then hopefully when they have babies and the babies fledge out from this nest. So it's going to be kind of an interesting story. If you want to follow that, make sure you check out my other YouTube channel linked in the description below. Here's a quick video showing the osprey pair, and we can actually see Edenville Dam in the background. That's how you know how close these are to what used to be Wixom Lake. I am in contact with the DNR, working with them to know what is the best way to document these birds. So if you want to see any more footage of the osprey, make sure you head on over to my other YouTube channel linked below and check that out. A lot more footage than that quick snapshot that I just gave you there. Now we're heading back towards the south, over top of the Edenville Dam, and we can just make out the Edenville Fall area here in the center of the screen. You can see a little bit of that white water. As we look a little bit further down the river, this is the Tittabawassee River here, we can see the South M30 bridge, and then the bridge way off in the distance is the Curtis Road Bridge. The water entering the right-hand side of the screen is the old river path. I'll talk about this in a little more detail pretty soon as we get a little bit different angle to see this from. Here is a good shot showing the old river path entering the left-hand side of the screen, the sediment blocking that river path right in the center of the screen, and the Edenville Falls and New River Path over on the right-hand side. Now I'm flying a little bit further towards the north. We are up at 400 feet in altitude. This is the limit, the legal limit to fly the drone at. And as I get directly over top of these Edenville Falls, I will go ahead and tilt the camera downward, and we will look directly down upon them. I always do this to kind of document how the falls have changed over the last year. It is very interesting seeing the amount of erosion happen. Again, this is down to clay. Clay is our bedrock here in Michigan, but it is still eroding this, and that's actually where a lot of the turbidity in the water, that kind of brownish color, comes from, is the clay deposits being washed into the flow of the river. It's actually one spot over on the right-hand side that's full of water, almost has like a turquoise color. Thought I remembered seeing a documentary on this as well. This happens when a large amount of water washes over a landscape. They kind of form these holes. And now coming down in altitude, probably about 100 to 50 feet, and we can get a little bit more detail here made out from the Edenville Falls. The water upstream of the falls is not very deep, probably only 1 to 2 feet deep. As I fly up this direction, that becomes a little bit more evident by the amount of clay sticking out. There's a little bit of sand here too, a lot of sand over on the left-hand side of the screen because all that Edenville embankment was constructed from the sand on Wixom Lake. The steam shovel that Michael found, that was actually its job, was to actually dig out that sand, and then it was transported over to the embankment here, as we're starting to see covered in grass, and then they would dump that sand there to kind of build up that embankment. Very interesting story. If you haven't saw that yet, make sure you go back in my videos and listen to the whole story on how they found it and the old legends of trying to dive for it when it used to be undercover, under the water of Wixom Lake. Now we're at the backside of the Edenville Dam, facing kind of northeast. Fly a little bit closer, but we can see the amount of erosion happening on the embankment, a little bit of that sand being exposed. All this will be repaired when this dam is being brought back up to standards. The water in this area is very stagnant, really just a turtle pond, frog pond, mosquito breeding ground. Hopefully this is being treated so we don't have a huge outbreak of mosquitoes again this year. There's still a little bit of stump sitting on top of this dam. This one actually looks like there's almost a brick attached to it. Was probably used to moor someone's boat to. But it's very evident how scoured and scarred the backside of that Edenville Dam is. Now flying back towards the northeast again at a little bit higher altitude, right over the top of this dam. And we'll get a little bit of a different perspective from this height. And kind of check out the top of the powerhouse in this area. Looks like there's been quite a few patches to it to keep it from leaking in. And as I get a little bit closer, look right behind that seawall. There's actually a blue heron in there, and he decides to fly out as I gain altitude a little bit further. He was probably sitting there doing some fishing, but right here you can see him go ahead and fly out that direction towards the north. I'm now going ahead and panning the camera upwards. We'll begin to start to see the new lake bottom, how green everything is getting, and the Tittabawassee River that is flowing this direction. It flows from north to south in this area. So now we can see just how green everything is on the lake bed. Spring has definitely arrived here in Michigan. This is a portion of the video flying on the old river path that is just towards the south of the Edenville Dam. And as I kind of come around this bend here, I'll turn the camera towards the west and we'll be able to see the amount of sediment blocking this old river path. That is what needs to be cleared out to restore the flow of water back over top of the Edenville Dam in this direction. The Edenville Dam spillway will also have to be lowered, just like the Tobacco River spillway, to restore this water flow. Again, that will cut off the new river path, though, that we are seeing flow over top of the Edenville Falls right here on the left-hand side of the screen. And that new river path they're planning on using for the emergency spillway. So right here, right where I'm over top of right now, is all the sediment blocking the old river path. You can see how turquoise the old river path water is because it's just pretty stagnant in there, versus the new river path has a lot of turbidity in it from the clay deposits that are being washed into the water stream. I'm now turning the drone around so that it is facing towards the south when I start to tilt this camera upwards, and we'll be able to see the destruction from when the Edenville embankment failed, how all these trees are just laid over and toppled and just completely wiped out in this area. And there is the M30 bridge there in the center of the screen. This shot is just another good overview of Edenville Falls on the left-hand side of the screen, the old river path at the bottom right-hand side of the screen, the sediment blocking that river path right in the center, and the new river path where we can see all that water flowing through in the direction towards the south right now. I'm going to cover some of the quick facts here for Wixom Lake. This is for both the Tobacco River Spillway and the Edenville Spillway. The Tobacco River Spillway had some interim stabilization efforts that are already complete. The Edenville Spillway still is undergoing and waiting to undergo repairs. But some of the quick facts here for both these dams are that it will cost $121 million to repair. There are 2,875 waterfront properties around the lake. The estimated lake return date is between 2025 and 2026, and the estimated annual capital assessment range is $1,720. Again, this is for Tobacco River and the Edenville Dam, so the cost is a little bit more. I'm going to hand over the presentation now to Paul and Ron from the Four Lakes Task Force to talk a little bit about the engineering diagrams and details. This will cover both the Edenville and Tobacco River Spillway as well. Both of these are located on Wixom Lake, so both these dams are kind of intertwined with their repairs. It's also important to keep in mind that this webinar was back from February 18th, so there may be some more current information, as well as the Tobacco River Spillway has already been lowered and project work complete there. So when they're going ahead and talking about those efforts, keep that in mind.
Thank you to everybody on the call for the opportunity to talk to you today about this project. Again, name's Paul Drew, Water Resources Engineer for GEI, and involved on not only on Wixom, but all of the other Four Lakes projects moving forward. So next slide, please. So before we get kind of into the technical portion of the presentation, just some general geometry and kind of our naming conventions for the project. As you know, Wixom Lake is very distinct river systems. The Tittabawassee River on the east and the Tobacco River on the west. And both of those rivers are separated by the former M30 highway causeway that was eroded and failed during the May 2020 flood event. And generally, in terms of dam safety, we use the terms left and right frequently to describe the structures, and left and right is always in a direction looking downstream. And for the Edenville project, generally, the projects consist of two major water retaining structures, earthen embankments, and then concrete gated Tainer Gate spillways that are used to pass base and flood flows, as well as manage Wixom lake levels. So the presentation today is not really focusing on generally the cause or the failure of the May 2020 flood event. There isn't a third-party investigation of the forensic study that's going to still be coming out of the exact cause of the failure. But generally, in terms of what happened, in terms of damage, is pretty well represented on this slide. This is on the Tittabawassee side, or the Edenville side of the project. The left embankment downstream was breached on May 19th, 2020. And as part of that breach, the existing Tainer Gate spillways on both the Edenville and Tobacco side were severely damaged. The powerhouse and the hydropower generating equipment was also damaged beyond repair. The spillways were damaged but are in good enough shape to be retrofitted for the long-term reconstruction. And in addition to that, the embankments were scoured and undermined, flanking both spillways, and the M30 causeway was washed out, and as you can see on that bottom picture here. Next slide, please. So in terms of ongoing stabilization work that Dave mentioned as part of the first few minutes, there are two phases of interim stabilization. The first phase is on the tobacco side with the ongoing construction that's currently going on right now. AECOM is another engineering firm that is currently leading that design, and Fisher Construction is out there currently working on it. GEI, we're involved as a third-party peer review for that design. And the main goals of that phase one stabilization, the first goal is to protect against further erosion on the river channel, and then also to restore the Tobacco River to its natural flow path through the Tanner Gate spillway. So to do this, there's a number of repairs of that concrete spillway that are currently underway, and the spill crest will actually be lowered about 15 feet to pass the tobacco flow and restore that flow path back into the Tobacco River. So as Dave mentioned, what that means in terms of Wixom Lake on the tobacco side is that impoundment is going to come down 10 to 15 feet over the next month or so. In addition to the work that's being done on the spillway, there is downstream river stabilization and shoreline restoration that is being performed. The MDOT highway bridge currently is being reconstructed in a temporary state to restore vehicle traffic across M30. And then as I mentioned, there's also embankment stabilization adjacent to the concrete spillway that was damaged during the May 19th flood event. The phase one funding, this is currently being funded through State of Michigan and NRCS funds, or a large portion of it. And then the long-term goal that we have is to use the stabilization work that's being done here in phase one and incorporating that into the long-term restoration or repair of the tobacco spillway. Next slide, please. So phase two, this is on the Edenville or Tittabawassee side. The roles here are a little bit reversed. GEI, we are currently in the design phase, and AECOM is going to be our technical third-party review. So it's not under construction yet, but we are still in the design phase with anticipation of starting construction this year. The goals at phase two remain very similar to phase one. Again, it's to protect against erosion and restore the Tittabawassee River back into the Tittabawassee river channel. Right now, all of the flow from Tobacco as well as the Tittabawassee are conveyed through the breach channel on the left embankment. And so by the time phase one and phase two is, both of those river channels will be restored back to its natural path. To do this work, the Tanner Gate spillway will be fully demolished down to the base slab. We are still currently in alternative design on what we do with the training walls, which are the tall retaining walls flanking the spillway, as well as what is going to happen to the powerhouse. The fix ranges from full removal of the powerhouse to keeping the powerhouse and retrofitting that as part of final design for the full restoration. So those alternatives will work itself out over the next few months. But at it's similar to the other phase one. There's also going to be downstream river stabilization and embankment stabilization that was scoured and failed during the May 20 event. One last feature that will be added is the breach channel to divert flow back to the Tittabawassee River. There will be a low dike that will be constructed, rock fill and steel sheet pile to close off that breach channel and direct that flow back into the Tittabawassee River. And last, there's two other items that are being considered. There is a significant amount of erosion on the earthen embankment near M30. That potentially will be stabilized as part of this project. And then lastly, there will be an installed of a navigational boom upstream of the Tobacco River spillway, mostly to promote boater and recreational safety, so that people that are still on the lake coming in the next couple of years, that they have warning before they get too close to the tobacco spillway. And similar to phase one, phase two is also largely funded by the state of Michigan and the NRCS. And all of the design that we're doing here, we also have an eye on the long-term restoration, so that what we're building here can be incorporated into the final design. Next, thank you. So speaking of the long-term restoration, once we move past the stabilization work, the goal again is to restore Wixom Lake back to its normal operating level. So what are the critical items for long-term restoration or reconstruction? The main one is spillway capacity or adequacy. So Edenville Dam is classified as a high hazard dam, and generally what that means is a high hazard dam has a large population downstream of the dam and a lot of infrastructure that would be negatively impacted or severely impacted by a failure. And this was highlighted in May of 2020. So that hazard rating is not going to change. It's still a high hazard dam. But in terms of spill capacity, prior to the failure, Edenville and Tobacco spillways could pass about 20,000 cubic feet per second, or CFS, before the water would overtop the embankments. The state of Michigan current requirement is what's called the half PMF at about 25,000 CFS. Well, I'll discuss PMF in a minute, but ultimately the story is we had a spillway capacity deficit between what Edenville could pass and what they were required to pass at the time of the failure. And based on our current ongoing flood studies and calibration and understanding of the May 20 flood event, that half PMF number of 25,000 CFS is going to significantly increase. So what we are currently working with in terms of spillway capacity requirement is more than double at about 52,000 CFS. Now, these numbers are not final for a number of reasons. And the first is the task force is taking on and redeveloping brand new probable maximum precipitation and probable maximum flood studies. And what a PMF basically means is, for this watershed, that's the largest amount of rainfall and largest flood that is realistically possible for this watershed. So for a typical FERC-regulated hydropower dam, the full PMF is the requirement for spillway capacity. The state of Michigan has a requirement for state-regulated dams of half that number, of half the PMF. Where this gets a little complicated and because these numbers aren't final, is following the failure, the state of Michigan formed a dam safety task force. And this is not to be confused with the Four Lakes Task Force, but what the Dam Safety Task Force is currently doing is they are reviewing the state of Michigan dam safety regulations, and they're going to provide a recommendation going forward of changes to their current regulations. So at the moment, we are preparing, long-term preliminary designs without fully having an answer on what the requirements are going to be. But we're developing a lot of conservatism into our designs, so that by the time the state of Michigan Dam Safety Task Force and EGLE approves these new regulations, that we'll be able to be prepared for that change. And ultimately what we're expecting is that the state of Michigan is going to go towards what's called a risk-based flood design criteria for determining how much how big the spillway capacity needs to be for this project. And so on the next slide, I'll discuss what a risk-based approach is. So this is a bit of a complicated topic, but I'm going to kind of try to break it down into a simple form. A risk-based approach generally aligns with the current FEMA guidelines for selecting design flood criteria. And you break it down into two main components. It's understanding of consequences if a dam fails and correlating that to a probability of that event happening that forces the dam to fail. So for example, on figure 1 here, the blue line is a consequence assuming the dam fails. The red line are the consequences assuming a dam does not fail. So for very small flood events, the gap between the two is very large because a dam failure would cause a lot of downstream impacts compared to a dam not failing. But when you start getting into these larger floods, we talk about PMF or half PMF, there's so much concurrent downstream flooding that's already occurring that sometimes the consequences of a dam failure and the consequences of it not failing are nearly identical. So we're performing these studies to try to answer these questions of at what storm event are there no new additional consequences? And that's what's called an inflow design flood or an IDF. So as we work through that to establish a reasonable design criteria based on consequence, we're also working to quantify what the probability of those consequences coming true. And so this approach is not the same for all projects, but generally if you understand the consequences and the probability, it's really a starting point for a risk-based design criteria selection. So as we work through these studies, we're going to present the results to Eagle in terms of a recommendation for spillway design criteria and ask for concurrence and work through them as well as the forthcoming recommendations from the Dam Safety Task Force. So this is a kind of a long-winded way of saying design criteria is not set, but we're going through all the prescribed procedures to come up with a risk-based decision on how big these new spillways are going to be. Next slide, please. All right, so moving past selection of design criteria, the next number of slides generally show where we're at with our 30% design for reconstructing these projects. This first view here, this is the Tobacco River side. Wixom Lake is on the top of the page, and the spillway, the current spillway is highlighted in the below the red box. But the point of this slide is to generally illustrate there's going to be significant upgrades to the existing earthen embankments. Right now, the embankments are too steep. They have a very narrow crest, and they don't generally meet current state of practice in terms of design criteria for stability or protection against seepage. All dams seep from upstream impoundments, but there are countermeasures that are put into place to mitigate against internal erosion from seepage. And so generally the fixes that we're proposing is to raise the embankment crest to provide us freeboard during large discharge flood events, widen the crest to acceptable width, and then flatten our downstream slopes, and then build in internal drainage countermeasures of cutoff walls to protect against seepage. Next slide. All right, so this is a zoomed in view of our former Tanner Gate spillway. The bottom stippling on the cross section generally shows the stabilized cross section of what we're going to be done with after phase one. We're going to use that as a foundation to build up a taller spillway with new hydraulically controlled crest gates to increase spillway capacity and route these larger design floods downstream. So this is going to significantly increase the current spillway capacity at the tobacco side. Next slide, please. And similarly on the Tittabawassee River side, the same types of embankment repairs, widening the crest, raising them, as well as flattening the downstream slopes. There also is going to be a new crest-gated spillway in the location of the former Tanner Gate spillway that's being demolished as part of phase two. The powerhouse is, as I mentioned, we're currently evaluating our options for the powerhouse. It's either going to be fully demolished or partially demolished to retrofit a new low-level outlet for controlling base flows. And then the largest new feature of the project is we're proposing to put a new auxiliary labyrinth spillway in the location of the breach channel. And what this helps solve is the problem that we observed in May of 2020 when the impoundment kept coming up. There was no auxiliary spillway in case of an emergency. So we're basically placing this emergency spillway in the exact location of the failure. And the intent here is to provide that additional spill capacity during extreme events, but really only use it during an emergency. This would only activate during those very large design floods. And normally all of the maintaining the pool and the flood flows would go through our new crest-gated spillways. Next slide, please. And this is another similar view of what we're doing on the Tittabawassee River, 3 new crest gates. And this structure will be new because the phase 2 stabilization will be demolishing the existing spillway. So we're basically working with from the ground up of that base slab that's going to be remaining in place. And then in terms of the auxiliary spillway, as I mentioned, this is it's a bit of an odd shape, but generally what it is it's a new passive labyrinth spillway, meaning there are no gates. When water comes up to this elevation, it will dump over and provide a place for the flood flows to go. The shape of it is generally in an accordion shape, and the point of this is you basically compress a very long weir into this accordion shape to get a much more efficient spillway capacity per linear foot compared to other typical spillways. We've done this approach in very northern climates in northern Minnesota and has worked very well as an auxiliary spillway. It's kind of a state-of-the-practice design where we have upstream steel cutoff sheets to provide that impervious layer for seepage protection, new structural fill for the new embankment, and it's lined in a concrete spillway chute. And then if it does discharge, all of the flood flow would be routed through the existing breach channel. The flood frequency of this would be a very rare event, meaning that this spillway would only activate during extreme floods and would typically remain dry. In terms of kind of a summary of the critical repair items for the existing water retaining structures, as we mentioned, the left embankment was completely breached and will need to be reconstructed with the auxiliary spillway. The portions of the remaining embankments were damaged during the rapid drawdown and scour of the May 20 event. As we mentioned before, the remaining embankments are too steep and do not meet standard of practice for stability criteria. The embankments leak excessively at full pool, meaning there's a lot of seepage going through the embankments. So we're proposing to build new seepage cutoff walls, and a secondary safety measure is that there would be an internal drainage system to collect any seepage that does get past the impervious wall. And then lastly, the total spillway capacity is significantly lacking at this project. And between the upgrades at both crest gate spillways as well as the auxiliary spillway will provide that level of protection required by EGLE. So the work that we still have cut out for us is a number of geotechnical and structural investigations and analyses are needed to support the final design. And all of these structures will be designed to meet state and federal dam safety standards. And the last 2 slides are just general depictions of our new embankments. This embankment is an illustration at the auxiliary spillway and the location of the breach. And what this represents is generally the state of practice for a brand new embankment. It provides the upstream riprap for protection against varying water levels and wave action. It has the steel sheet pile cutoff to protect against seepage. You'll see that there is an internal drainage system for any seepage that does get through our impervious wall that will be controlled and sent through an exit at the toe. And then downstream there is riprap protection to protect against high tailwater or scour during large flood events. And then the last slide that I have prepared here, this is the majority of the embankments that did not fail. We're not proposing to tear those down and start from scratch. This is more of a retrofit design where we'll still be adding a riprap upstream to protect against wave action. We'll be driving a new steel sheet pile cutoff wall down into the foundation layer below. We'll be adding some embankment fill to raise the embankment and flatten the downstream slopes. And then we will add an internal drainage system on the downstream face of our new embankment slopes to mitigate any seepage that wants to come through our embankment in a controlled fashion. And then lastly, there will be new riprap to protect against high tailwater events. So that's the last of my slides. I think Ron Hansen is going to take it from here.
Thanks, Paul. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ron Hansen. I'm an engineer for the Four Lakes Task Force. I work with Spicer Group, headquartered in Saginaw. I appreciate everybody taking the time out this afternoon to get an update on the progress that's being made for the restoration of the Edenville Dam. I'm going to spend some time talking about the scheduling and timing of the repairs. So we have schedule considerations and constraints. And the first thing I want to point out is, you know, our primary duty, we all have a duty of care to keep people safe. So we're doing everything we can to make sure that these dams are built according to safety standards. And I think Paul did an excellent job of explaining all of the process and thought and engineering design that goes into that. So in addition to the engineering design, the final construction timeline also considers other things, such as receiving regulatory permits, receiving financial approval, establishing assessment roles, and getting approval from the counties. So the way that this project is being administered is through Part 307 of the Michigan law, Public Act 451 of 1994. And so that Part 307 really dictates the process. And then right now we are working with the United States Department of Agriculture for financing, and they have a process as well. What we're doing is trying to run as many paths in parallel to speed up and get to construction, but it's going to be a long process here. And next slide, Kayla. So Paul talked a lot about engineering design, and you know, to talk about the engineering design phase, again, it's more than just designing of the dam. You know, there's significant efforts in computer modeling, in environmental impact study, and permitting. And on this screen, you can see all of the steps that have to be followed, starting with a flood study, then doing investigations and analysis of embankments and gates, going through an environmental analysis, looking at wetlands, streams, floodplains, ecosystem, going through the final design phase and all of the disciplines of engineering, receiving approval from EGLE, receiving approval from USDA, receiving approval on a local level, establishing our contract documents and specifications, and getting to a point where we bid the project out to qualified contractors. At that point in time, we will know what the final cost would be. We would do a computation of cost and eventually issue a notice to proceed. So before we may begin construction, as Paul had mentioned, there is an independent forensic investigation that's being conducted. We will need to get the results of that report and the considerations of that report. We'll also, as Paul mentioned, need to develop these preliminary engineering reports and get the inflow design flood or the spillway capacity requirements established and approved, and then go through final design. During this process, you know, we will be coordinating with USDA and making submittals to USDA and doing all of the steps to get funding approval. We will do the same with the environmental studies in EGLE. And as I mentioned, it'll culminate with the bid letting, a special assessment hearing, and approval of the special assessment role by the county board. So with the special assessment hearing, it will be at that point in time where all of the people who live in the special assessment district around Wixom Lake, and again, this is being set up on a lake-by-lake basis, so the folks at Wixom Lake will be invited to a special assessment hearing where you can see what your percentage of the cost would be, see what the cost to reconstruct Wixom Lake would be, and then if you believe that your percentage of the cost was unfairly calculated in comparison to how your neighbors and other people percentages were calculated, there is an appeal process for that. And then ultimately, the County Board of Commissioners will have to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down approval on the special assessment roll. So on this slide, we've got a detailed breakdown of the schedule for the Edenville Dam Recovery and Restoration Plan. It's important to note that this schedule was developed with the assumption that we would get financing through the USDA for the construction portion of the project, but for the engineering and environmental and all of the work that needs to be done before construction, that would be covered by grants. And the Four Lakes Task Force has been aggressively, pursuing grants and we'll continue to do that. So when we look at this schedule, we've broken it down into the recovery phase, the financing phase, the engineering phase, the bid letting phase, and the construction phase. When we start with the recovery phase, Paul had mentioned the interim repairs that are ongoing right now, and those interim repairs started in October of 2020. They will continue up until about May of 2020. Right now, the tobacco side is being worked on, and as Dave Rothman mentioned, folks should be seeing the press releases about the water lowering that's going to happen soon. Once the tobacco side is finished, the interim repairs on the Tittabawassee side will begin. It's likely those are going to begin in June of this year, sometime during the summer, and you'll see an extensive construction project occurring with that culminating in May of 2022. While that's going on, the Four Lakes Task Force will be working on financing. We have been meeting with the United States Department of Agriculture and are coordinating with them on a financing package. So what will happen is in May of 2021, there will be an initial feasibility study that will be presented to the community and to the counties. At that point in time, we will have the design concepts that Paul outlined, all presented in a report, along with planning level estimates, preliminary estimates of cost, and sort of projections of how the project would be financed and what the expectation for the assessments would be, and where the funding gaps would be, and what kind of grants and funding assistance we're pursuing. We will be receiving input from the community on the feasibility report, and that'll, at the same time we're receiving input, we're going to be working on a preliminary engineering report that we would submit to the USDA for financing approval. We would expect to start that process or make that initial submittal in January of 2022, and we're expecting that it's going to take about a year and a half to get through the initial reviews to a point where the USDA gives us preliminary approval. And then there's a second phase of the financing where once we finalize the engineering plans and we have all of the environmental permits and construction permits and all of the other procedural requirements in place, we would submit that to them. They would do a final review and obligation for financing. And basically financing is a loan, it's a bond. We expect that to be in place in August of 2023. The engineering track will also be ongoing at the same time as the financing track. The first step of that is to complete the probable maximum precipitation and probable maximum flood study that Paul talked about. We're expecting those to be completed initially in June of 2021. Then those would be submitted to the regulatory agencies and be reviewed, and that would culminate in a selection of an understanding of flow rates and what the design criteria would be. We should know that in September of 2021. At the same time, this sort of risk-based inflow design flood study that Paul talked about will be ongoing. And that'll take about a year, starting in September of 2020 and ending in September of 2021. That'll then be submitted to the regulatory agencies for review and acceptance. We're projecting that process will end in January of 2022, at which time design engineering would take place, and we would go through final design. Final design would be completed in May of 2023. Also, environmental studies are ongoing. Environmental studies would be completed in May of 2023. In May of 2023, we would expect to submit for our environmental permits, have those in hand in November of 2023. Then we go through a bid letting process. That's where we solicit construction bids from qualified contractors. We expect to receive bids in 2024, February of 2024. During that same process where we're looking at bidding, we're also conducting a special assessment hearing. So that's when you would get your notice to have the special assessment hearing, where you would see what the apportionment and what your portion of the project cost would be, and then the appeal period, and then going to the county for approval. That ends in February 2024, with the hope that we get into the construction phase, and construction starts April of 2024. Now we're budgeting roughly the summer of 2024, the summer of 2025, and the summer of 2026. This is going to take a long time to construct. Essentially, you have 2 dams, and that would culminate in the fall of 2026.
Thanks for watching, and make sure you hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video. Also, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next videos I will be posting, and leave your questions, comments, and suggestions below. As always, I just want to give a massive thanks to the people who support me on Patreon. Never underestimate the value of your contribution to keeping this channel going. Thank you.